What if I told you the inflation crisis in America never actually ended? It just became quieter, harder to measure, and far more dangerous beneath the surface. Think about the last time you walked out of a grocery store, looked at your receipt, and genuinely felt like the total made sense. For most Americans over the age of 50, that moment doesn't just feel rare, it feels like something from a completely different time. And there's a very specific reason for that disconnect. Right now, if you turn on the news, you'll hear that inflation is sitting at 2.4% as of February 2026. Technically, that number is correct. But what it doesn't tell you is far more important than what it does. That 2.4% only measures how fast prices are still rising today. It says nothing about how much damage has already been done over the past few years. And that missing context is where the real story begins. If you're finding this breakdown helpful, consider subscribing. You'll get notified every time I post, and you'll be part of a growing community that genuinely means a lot to me. Many of you already know what's been happening with the channel, and I just want to pause for a second to say thank you. The support, the messages, the encouragement, it all matters more than you probably realize. If you feel like going a step further, there's a link in the description and comments, but there's absolutely no pressure. Just being here is already more than enough. Now let's get into what's really happening. Imagine driving your car straight into a wall. Then right after the crash, someone runs up and says, "Good news, you've slowed down to 10 miles per hour." That might sound positive on the surface, but the reality is obvious. You're still hitting the wall. That's exactly what a 2.4% inflation rate represents, when prices have already surged 25.67% since 2020. 6 years ago, $100 worth of groceries would fill your cart. Today, that same cart costs about $125.67. The money didn't just lose a little value, roughly a quarter of its purchasing power vanished. And when you break this down into specific categories, the numbers become even harder to ignore. Rent has climbed 28.9% since the pandemic began. Food prices overall are up between 20 and 25%, with the steepest increases hitting essentials like meat, dairy, and eggs. Medical and hospital services saw their biggest annual jump since 2010, rising 6.7% in 2025 alone. Even everyday comforts like coffee and tea jumped 11.8% in a single year, while beef and veal ran 14.4% higher compared to just a year earlier, as recently as February 2026. Entire cities, San Diego, Tampa, Miami, have seen cumulative price increases above 30% since 2020. And these aren't extreme outliers. These are places where millions of retirees moved specifically because they once felt affordable. The official inflation rate tracks how fast the fire is still burning, but it ignores how much of the house has already burned down. And that gap between reported data and lived reality is exactly where the real crisis exists. Nothing illustrates this disconnect better than something as simple as eggs. And before dismissing that as too small to matter, stay with me because the story of eggs is actually a window into how fragile the entire system has become. For decades, a dozen eggs in the United States typically stayed below $2. That was just normal. It was predictable. It was stable. Then, in early 2022, the H5N1 avian influenza hit, triggering the largest bird flu outbreak in U.S. history. Federal regulations required that entire flocks be culled the moment infection appeared, and almost overnight, the egg supply collapsed faster than anyone expected. By January 2023, prices had already surged to $4.82 per dozen, which at the time felt shocking. But it didn't stop there. By March 2025, a dozen eggs reached $6.23. To put that into perspective, eggs cost about 88 cents per dozen back in 1980. Since then, prices have come back down to around $2.50 as of February 2026. And headlines frame that as a win, as if things had returned to normal. But that's not what actually happened. The drop to $2.50 isn't a recovery, it's a warning. It shows how quickly a single disruption in a single supply chain can send the price of a basic staple tripling within just a few years. No one predicted it, no one stopped it. And that's the real lesson here. It's not about eggs, it's about how fragile the system underneath them truly is. And if eggs exposed how fragile everyday essentials can be, Housing is where this crisis stops being something you notice at the checkout counter and turns into something that can shape an entire lifetime. Because once housing becomes unaffordable, it doesn't just hurt your monthly budget, it reshapes your future, your retirement, and your sense of stability in ways that are incredibly difficult to reverse. Since 2019, home prices across the United States have climbed by roughly 60%, pushing the median price of an existing single-family home to a record $412,500 in 2024. That number alone is enough to raise concern, but what really matters is how it compares to income. Researchers at Harvard's Joint Center for Housing Studies describe the situation with unusual directness. The median home price is now about 5 times the median household income. For decades, the accepted standard was closer to 3 times income. That was considered manageable, sustainable, and realistic. But the country didn't just pass that threshold, it kept going, creating a gap that continues to widen. Then mortgage rates entered the picture and made everything even more difficult in a way that compounds the problem instead of just adding to it. In June 2021, mortgage rates were sitting at around 2.99%. By June 2025, they had more than doubled to 6.82%. That change alone transformed affordability. On a $300,000 mortgage, the difference between those rates adds about $580 to the monthly payment. So now you have a situation where home prices are significantly higher at the exact same time that borrowing money has become far more expensive. And while all of this is happening, incomes have remained mostly flat. A household earning the national median income of about $74,200 would need to spend around 34% of their income just to cover the mortgage on a median price new home. For lower income families, that number jumps to around 67% of everything they earn. The Atlanta Federal Reserve's Housing Affordability Monitor shows that owning a median priced home now consumes nearly 48% of a typical household's income, and that level has stayed almost unchanged for 2 straight years. What this looks like in real life is even more striking. A household earning $75,000 a year, people like nurses, teachers, and skilled workers who have traditionally formed the backbone of the American middle class, can now afford only about 21% of the homes currently listed for sale. Just a few years ago, in March 2019, that same household could afford nearly half the market at 49%. In other words, access to housing didn't shrink slightly, it was cut down dramatically in a very short period of time. For households earning $50,000 a year, which represents about 1/3 of the US population, the situation is even more restrictive. Only 9% of homes are now within reach, compared to 28% just a few years earlier. According to the National Association of Home Builders, nearly 76 million households, about 57% of all households in the country, cannot afford a $300,000 home. That's not a small segment of the population. That's more than half, and the pressure doesn't stop with buyers. Even homeowners who might want to sell are caught in a situation that works against them. Nearly half of homeowners with government-backed mortgages locked in rates at 3.5% or lower. Selling their home would mean stepping into a new mortgage with a rate that could double or even triple their monthly payment. So they stay where they are. Fewer homes go on the market. Inventory stays tight. Prices remain elevated. And the people trying to enter the market find themselves stuck on the outside, waiting for an opportunity that doesn't seem to arrive. It becomes a cycle where every part of the system reinforces the next, making it harder for the situation to correct itself. All of that financial strain has to show up somewhere, and increasingly, it's showing up in credit card balances. And the numbers here are not subtle, they are historically significant. By the third quarter of 2025, outstanding credit card debt reached $1.233 trillion, the highest level ever recorded since tracking began in 1999. That figure is roughly 60% higher than the pandemic-era low of $770 billion seen in early 2021. At the same time, the average interest rate on those balances climbed to 21.39%, another record. What this means in practical terms is that Americans are borrowing more money than ever before, at the highest costs ever recorded, just to keep up with everyday expenses that are significantly higher than they were a few years ago. Around 68 million Americans, nearly 1 in 3 credit card holders, are now using 30% or more of their available credit, a level that financial experts classify as a sign of debt stress. And these 68 million individuals account for about 63% of all credit card debt, which comes out to nearly $800 billion. Another 27 million Americans, more than 1 in 9 cardholders, can no longer afford to pay more than the minimum monthly payment. That's where the situation becomes particularly difficult, because once you're only paying the minimum, the interest grows faster than the balance shrinks. Over time, that turns temporary borrowing into something that feels permanent. Total household debt across all categories, including mortgages, has now reached a record $18.59 trillion. And when you look at how people feel about their financial future, the data reflects this pressure clearly. A Bankrate survey found that 32% of Americans expect their financial situation to get worse in 2026, the highest level of pessimism recorded since the survey began in 2018. Nearly 2/3 of respondents identified inflation as their main concern, and about 46% of Americans have consistently reported that high prices are putting direct strain on their finances for 7 straight months. These aren't people misunderstanding the economy. These are people adapting to it, using credit to stay level in a system where the cost of living keeps rising faster than their income. Up to this point, everything we've talked about reflects the damage already done by the last wave of inflation. But what has serious economists paying attention right now isn't just the past, it's the next wave that appears to be forming quietly underneath the surface. And the driving force behind it is something that doesn't always get discussed in everyday conversations: tariffs. The Tax Foundation has described the current round of tariffs as the largest increase in American taxes as a percentage of GDP since 1993. That's not a small adjustment, it's a structural shift. JP Morgan's chief U.S. economist Michael Feroli calculated that the average effective tariff rate jumped from around 10% to just over 23%, marking the largest increase since the Revenue Act of 1968. When you translate those numbers into real-world impact, the implications become clearer. JP Morgan estimates that these measures alone could push consumer prices up by an additional 1 to 1.5% in 2026, stacked directly on top of everything that has already happened. And some projections go even further. Commerce Bank's chief economist, Bill Adams, suggested that tariffs could add between 3% and 5% more inflation over the next year and a half than would have occurred otherwise. But one of the most important warnings comes from Harvard economist Alberto Cavallo, and it hasn't received nearly as much attention as it should. His research found that tariff-related price increases of about 5.4% started showing up in retail goods as early as April 2025. More importantly, those increases didn't stay limited to imported goods. They spread to domestically produced alternatives as well, pushing overall inflation higher than expected. His analysis suggests that tariffs have already added roughly 0.7 percentage points to overall CPI inflation. But the key insight isn't just about how much prices rise, it's about when. Cavallo argues that the impact of tariffs tends to unfold more slowly than people expect, meaning the full effect may not have fully appeared in 2025. In other words, the pressure isn't gone, it's delayed. And that delay matters, because it means the next phase of inflation could arrive, even as people are still dealing with the consequences of the last one. This connects directly back to housing, where tariffs are expected to increase the cost of building a new single-family home by anywhere between $10,000 and $25,000, according to data from the National Association of Home Builders. So now you have an affordability crisis in construction, layered on top of an existing shortage of homes, combined with higher borrowing costs. Each of these problems doesn't exist in isolation, they reinforce one another, making the overall system more difficult to stabilize. To understand why this situation isn't resolving quickly, you have to look at the role of the Federal Reserve. Between March 2022 and August 2023, the Fed raised interest rates 11 consecutive times, bringing them up to a range of 5.25% to 5.5%, the highest level since early 2001. This was done in response to inflation peaking at 9.1% in June 2022, the highest level in nearly 40 years. Then, over the course of 2024 and 2025, the Fed shifted direction and implemented 6 rate cuts, lowering rates to between 3.5% and 3.75%. As of March 2026, those rates have been held steady for the second consecutive meeting. But at the same time, the Fed revised its own inflation forecast upward, increasing its expectation for 2026 from 2.4% to 2.7%. That adjustment may seem small, but it carries a larger message. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell acknowledged the uncertainty directly, stating, "We have an energy shock of some size and duration. We don't know what that will be." What that means in practical terms is that even the institution responsible for managing inflation is openly uncertain about what comes next and is now expecting slightly higher inflation than it did before. That uncertainty becomes more concerning when you consider how many Americans are already financially stretched. When 27 million people can only afford minimum payments on their credit cards, even small increases in costs can have outsized effects. And history offers a reminder that situations like this don't always move in a straight line. In the 1970s, the Federal Reserve cut interest rates after seeing inflation begin to fall, only for inflation to return even stronger shortly afterward. The current situation isn't identical, but the pattern is close enough that many economists are watching carefully rather than assuming stability. At the same time, consumer sentiment is reflecting this unease. The University of Michigan's Consumer Sentiment Index registered 53.3 inches March 2026, which is close to the all-time low of 50 recorded in June 2022 during the peak of pandemic-era inflation. Over more than 70 years, the average reading for this index has been above 80. That gap tells a story that a single inflation number cannot capture. Joanne Su, who directs the survey, described this shift clearly. This is a sharp and significant decline over a short period of time, and consumers are expressing that they believe the economic outlook has worsened since the start of the year. Expectations for inflation over the next year have also risen, reaching 3.8% in March 2026, the largest monthly increase since April 2025, and well above the range that held steady before the pandemic. What's particularly notable is that people are not confused about why prices are rising. By September 2025, around 60% of consumers were spontaneously mentioning tariffs in survey responses, up from just 28% at the beginning of that same year. That shift shows that individuals are actively connecting policy decisions to the costs they experience in their daily lives. Greg McBride, chief financial analyst at Bankrate, summed up the situation after one of the more positive inflation readings of the year by saying, "That was nice, but don't get used to it." His point was straightforward. Consumers, businesses, and even policymakers are preparing for higher prices in the months ahead. When you step back and look at everything together, the picture becomes clearer. Since 2020, prices have increased by 25.67%. Credit card debt has reached record levels at record interest rates. Housing costs now consume nearly half of a typical household's income. Medical expenses are rising at their fastest pace in over a decade. Tariffs are expected to push prices even higher, with some of their impacts still yet to fully appear. And the Federal Reserve itself has revised its inflation expectations upward while acknowledging uncertainty about the future. The official 2.4% inflation rate isn't incorrect, but it only tells part of the story. It measures how quickly prices are rising right now, not how much has already changed, and not what may be coming next. That gap between the headline number and everyday experience isn't confusion, and it isn't pessimism, it's awareness. It's the result of living through years of rising costs, watching purchasing power decline, and sensing that the system is still adjusting in ways that haven't fully played out. When you walk out of a store and feel like something doesn't add up, that feeling isn't just emotional. It reflects real, measurable changes that have taken place over time. A 25% increase in costs, years of financial pressure, growing debt, and another potential wave forming ahead. These are not abstract ideas. They are realities that people are experiencing directly. And if there's one thing to take from all of this, it's simple. Pay attention. Because this story isn't over yet.